This video is brought to you by the lovely members of my Patreon who allow me to make this and other exclusive content. Thank you and enjoy.
Today is a most important day, and for some, a terrifying one. For today is the day London's marriage-minded misses are presented to Her Majesty, the Queen.
Back in the 90s, a television adaptation of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, or as we say in the streets, Brandy's Cinderella, now streaming on Disney+, you're welcome, delivered a colorblind casting depiction of the classic tale, with Victor Garber and Whoopi Goldberg having a Filipino son with no questions asked. The Broadway musical Hamilton did something similar, taking advantage of the stage to allow historically white people to be played by BIPOC actors. Hulu's Harlot, before it completely jumped the shark, was one of the few working-class period dramas depicting not only people of color, actors with disabilities, and LGBTQ characters. Jodie Turner-Smith, best known for playing Queen in Queen and Slim, is going to be playing Anne Boleyn for the 1000th adaptation of that dead but iconic white lady. I will say though, I saw the pictures and she looked good, man. I love seeing the Jamaican in green. Let's get together and steal white rolls. And we are simply just getting more and more colorblind depictions of British historical dramas. But most of the time, race isn't really mentioned, with Harlot being one of the big exceptions to that rule. And also Dickinson on Apple TV, which I don't think a lot of people are watching, but is actually pretty good. I thought Bridgerton, the popular Regency romance drama from Netflix adapted from Julia Quinn's novels, was gonna do something similar to Cinderella, create a colorblind, idealistic society. And then episode 4 happened. In the episode An Affair of Honor, two black characters, Lady Danbury and Simon Bassett, have a conversation about how through marriage elevated black nobles into the ranks of the nobility.
Look at our queen. Look at our king. Look at their marriage. Look at everything it is doing for us, allowing us to become. We were two separate societies, divided by color, until a king fell in love with one of us.
With this new context, there's an earlier episode where we were shown Simon's father, the former Duke of Hastings, saying that they had been gifted their position by the king, and gives the Regency era of the twice as good speech to Simon. Cause, you know, gotta have black trauma somewhere.
God, do you know how precarious of a situation we are in, boy? We have been granted this line. The monarchy itself has declared it. But it will only remain ours so long as we remain extraordinary.
This is the moment that Bridgerton stops being a surface-level colorblind story and attempts to discuss realistic racial issues in an AU historical world. And what we get as a result is complicated. So let's discuss Bridgerton as a book, as an adaptation, and as an attempt to herald in a new progressive era of Regency romance.
May God have mercy on their souls.
Published in 2000, The Duke and I is the first in the Bridgerton series by Julia Quinn, about the 8 Bridgerton siblings finding love in Regency-era England as you do. These alphabetically named siblings are Anthony, oldest grumpy boy, Benedict, the one everyone thought was bisexual, Colin, sassy green eyes, Daphne, our protagonist this novel, Eloise, the feminist killjoy, Francesca, away for most of the story, Gregory, child, and Hyacinth, also a child. A lot of children in this book, don't know why. Can't say I approve. The first book is about Daphne falling in love with Simon Bassett, Duke of Hastings. There are a number of significant differences between the source material and the show, beyond the obvious point that the book has no black people in it. So if your auntie, your friend, etc. wanted to see that fine brother that they have playing the Duke, tell her or them that they're going to be into more of a Richard Armitage flavor when it comes to the Duke. Not that bad if you gotta go there. One of the biggest changes is with Daphne herself. Rather than being the diamond of the ton. Speaking of which, what the fuck is a ton? Let me go to my research. It's hard to do anything with these gloves. Ton, toothpicks, toys. Just fancy elite shit. Okay, that's boring. I wonder what this book has to say about black people. When we meet her in the book, this is her third or second year out, and she has yet to marry because she's looking for true love. And the men around her see as more of a friend than a romantic choice because she's just so quaint. Simon ends up meeting Daphne when he stumbles upon her rejecting and then punching Nigel Bearbrook. I didn't write it in the script because he's boring, and we just know it's Nigel, not Thornberry. Disrespect on his name. The two end up doing their fake dating thing, and then Diamond ends up sucking on Daphne's titty. I mean bosom. In the garden, Anthony walks in on them and duel. After a lot of whinging, Daphne marries the Duke once Simon makes it clear that he can't have children, his words. One of the key character changes is that the show erases Simon's stutter. It still happens to him in the book when he is flustered or anxious. Something I personally wish the series had kept because it would be nice to see the representation in a romantic character, and a romantic lead especially. He doesn't have the same relationship with Lady Danbury, and in the book is more of a solitary figure who spends most of his time away from England in Africa. We know what that means.
Don't scare me like that, colonizer.
I don't want to get into some of the specific differences yet, especially as they have to deal with the discourse. But I will say that Daphne is one of the biggest character changes personality-wise thus far. While I wouldn't say that Daphne is boring in the show, she seems to me as a very much elevated Jane Bennett type, in the sense that she is a beauty and the eldest girl who sets the fancy standard. In the book, you get a feeling that Daphne is more of a Jane Austen protagonist character, slightly less idealistic, a little bit less finely polished. The book doesn't focus much on the sisters or the other characters, so we don't see much of Eloise and her feminist killjoyness, and Marina is not there at all. Neither is all stuff with the Featheringtons. That's all kind of in the background along with the royal shenanigans. The book itself, it is a quick read, and overall it is fine, but even while I was reading it, I couldn't help but compare it to the much more inclusive and engaging romance I've been reading over the last few years. And I'm not quite sure why ultimately this series was chosen to be adapted by Shonda Rhimes, even though I will get into that in the next part. But here we are. According to an interview on Tamron Hall, Quinn said, "Shonda ran out of books to read on vacation and somehow stumbled on one of mine. So that's how we end up with Bridgerton, the TV show. Shonda Rhimes just happened to read it." Getting thirsty. Despite being under the Shondaland umbrella, the show is not helmed by Shonda Rhimes. She is a producer. Chris Van Dusen is the showrunner and has worked with Shonda Rhimes on Grey's Anatomy, Private Practice, and Scandal. All the writers on the series, save for Van Duden, are women, but only one, according to my research, Joy C. Mitchell, is a black woman, which seems like an oversight. Due to being an 8-episode, hour-long plus series, the show pulls from multiple other threads, setting up characters who don't play a big role in the first book, but show up in later segments, like establishing all the siblings. The biggest difference being that the series includes people of color, mostly lighter-skinned people of color. As mentioned before, the series frames its race relationships around the idea that King George III married a biracial Queen Charlotte, who was played by a very talented Guyanese-British lesbian actress. We stand. This marriage has allegedly allowed black nobility into the ranks of the British aristocracy and solved racism.
I never thought that this would be easy, but I thought it would be fair.
Van Dusen told The Hollywood Reporter, quote, "Underneath all the glamour and the licentiousness in this beautiful escapist world, there's this running modern commentary about how in the last 200 years, everything has changed, but nothing has changed for both women and men. So exploring those themes were important. And I wanted modern audiences to see themselves on screen, unless they were dark skinned." Our approach approach to race is one example of that. I don't refer to the show as being colorblind. Race isn't really talked about in the books or considered in the books, but I don't think that's true for Bridgerton the series. This racial discourse has been at the very heart of the show's appeal. Sadly, as soon as you turn on a single episode, you see how shallow the representation is. Almost every major speaking role belongs to a mixed-race black person, with the exception of the actor playing Simon's gorgeous friend, Will. Mwah. And Richard Peeble as Duke of Hastings, who is serving toxic black paternity to the gods, okay? Can we stop having evil dark-skinned fathers? Evil black dads can be light-skinned too, you know. Classic colorism. As a refresher, colorism. Colorism is the prejudice or discrimination against individuals with a dark skin tone, typically among people of the same ethnic or racial group. However, it applies to people outside of that group as well, especially white mainstream society, which may see a lighter-skinned black person or person of color as an acceptable diversity pick. Now, this does not make the person less black or Asian, etc., unless they are, you know, dolazoling, because then they wouldn't be anything other than white, but it is a preference that participates in the marginalization of darker skinned folks. The fact that every single black person of merit in this show, save one, is played by a biracial black person, and the most violent, abusive paternal figure is also the darkest character on the show, well, you can see how this is a problem. The last time Shonda produced something in this genre was with Still Starcrossed, and the lead in that was LaShawna Rashida Lynch, aka Miss Maria Photon Rambo 007 herself. More so, none of the black female characters who are present get any genuine romantic roles. Queen Charlotte is suffering with her husband's mental illness, which causes him to act violently towards her. Lady Danbury is playing matchmaker. Genevieve Delacroix, the modiste, is getting dick, but it's just temporary if the show is following book canon. And then there's Marina. Marina seems to only exist to suffer and go through the longest first trimester in history because her baby bump remains non-existent from beginning to end. Okay, it's exhausting. I feel cheated the most with Marina because at the time of her arrival, she is situated to be one of the super desirable women of the
That Lady Featherington is to receive what she has always desired. The season's true incomparable living under her own roof. She must be overjoyed.
But due to her surprise pregnancy out of wedlock, she is locked away. For the rest of the show, she is made to suffer under the threat of poverty or being married to a super creepy old dude, and not in a fun Beetlejuice way. Without Marina, we see no eligible woman of color her age speak, despite the large Asian population and black populations in Britain today. I bring this up not because it reflects the historical accuracy of the time, but because the show is trying to be diverse as a whole, and considering that the total current Asian British population makes up the biggest ethnic group in Britain after white people, it's just like a massive oversight to have no major Asian characters on this show.
We did it, Joe.
When it comes to cries of historical accuracy, I play my tiniest, smallest, worst pianoforte. Y'all need to really just stop being weird about that. You just have to deal with it. I'm sorry everything can't be Downton Abbey. The other issue concerning race and Bridgerton is that Julia Quinn has allegedly made comments during panels about not including people of color in her books because she'd have to explain why they were there and they would have to suffer because of their status.
Somebody asked me that question recently about introducing more diversity into my books, and it's difficult because first with the time period that I write in, I mean, some say, oh, well, it really was diverse. I'm like, well, not among the dukes. And granted, my people aren't quite as lofty as Eloise's, but it's tricky because, you know, you read these Civil War romances and they've been kind of out of fashion for a while, and you're like, you know, isn't it interesting that, you know, the heroine always seems to feel that her slave is really truly her equal. And I'm thinking, well, she wasn't raised that way. She'd have to be pretty remarkable to have figured this out on her own. So if she's gonna feel that way, you need to explain to me how that came about. And a lot of times they didn't. And so, you know, I think, okay, I want to introduce diversity into my books, maybe put a Jewish character in there. There were Jews in England at the time, but you know what? A lot of people really didn't like them. And for me to explain why my characters, who I like to think are fundamentally good and kind and true, suddenly find these people to be perfectly fine and yeah, sure, marry him, no problem, we don't care. I'd have to come up with a really good explanation of how that came about, and that might have to be the story more than the actual love story. So it's tricky to do. For all the things I can do, I don't know what it's like to be in another person's skin, and I especially don't know what it means to be in another person's skin when their skin is so very different from mine. And I mean, it's hard enough at times just to write being a man. I don't know that what Ellie was saying about owning something, I don't know that I could write a story where really getting into what it feels like to be that marginalized.
Hi, Editor Princess here. So I just wanted to add a little bit of commentary to this clip because I found it during the editing process and it wasn't in part of the initial script. In viewing the entire clip and the entire panel, I don't necessarily disagree with the core of Quinn's message, being as she doesn't have the range to discuss it in a thoughtful way, then she shouldn't. And I do think that we want to elevate authors of color in the romance genre than just asking every single, prominent white romance author to create a person of color lead. However, the language that she used was just very clumsy and very dismissive, and I think that's also part of the problem and why this topic and why her name is so infamous in this discussion is because we have existed and we have been the relationship between Black people in Britain is it's not special, it's not great, but there's a little bit more nuance to it, and I think that her explanation just really lacked in nuance, and that's why it's so frustrating to so many people. Now this is particularly interesting to me because I just recently watched an episode of Dickinson in which they have this Black subplot of this character named Henry who is starting this abolitionist magazine newspaper, and while they're talking about freeing their people and defeating slavery, they're also having fun and partying because yes, Black people and people of color have suffered historically, but you know what? We still make time to create everything that you love in pop culture, so how about including us in your romance novels? You don't have to explain us away. We exist because you brought us to these places, you assaulted us, you created the ecosystem in which we exist. Representation in Bridgerton leaves a lot to be desired, but it is important that period dramas normalize this kind of casting. But also, now no one can say that a show like Bridgerton cannot be made, so hop to it, the rest of the world. The Alyssa Cole novels are waiting. Bridgerton also arose at a very interesting time. Due to the popularity of the PG-13 blockbuster aimed at family audiences, we have had largely sexless films where some of the hottest stars of our time are rarely even seen shirtless on screen. Beyond Netflix, the rom-com has largely been dead. A genre that was paramount in launching the careers of some of the most iconic female stars in Hollywood isn't really there. We are in a notoriously sexless era of media. In 2020, Carrie Whitmer wrote for The Ringer about which Hollywood sex symbols actually have sex on screen. Whitmer found that the actor with the most amount of sex scenes in movies was Keanu Reeves with a whopping 568.92 seconds of on-screen sex. But thank you, King. We appreciate you. She concluded that, quote, "There is not a lot of sex in American cinema. This is the case for a few reasons, including that many actors have reputations to maintain in order to get and or keep getting lucrative works in major motion pictures. As a result, the main sexual outlet for many has been Starz' Outlander, which despite its many rape scenes and deeply problematic issues, it has still been given the staple of mom porn. Of course, it would be wrong to blatantly call Outlander a romance because the author herself, Diana Gabaldon, has constantly iterated that she does not really see Outlander as a romance, even though, A romance is a courtship story. In the 19th century, the definition of the romance genre was an escape from daily life that included adventure and love in battle. But in the 20th century, that term changed, and now it's deemed only a love story, specifically a courtship story. Girl, just click the bag. Enter a show like Bridgerton, which takes a romance novel, gives it a budget, has a great cast puts the Shonda name on it and it's launched on one of the biggest streaming platforms of all time during the holidays, you have a hit. It's February and it's still in the top 10. So much of romantic cinema has been defined by heteronormative white male patriarchy that in some ways it makes sense that we have drifted slightly from it. Yet, romance novels continue to be an important indicator of how the romance genre has evolved. The modern romance genre has been at the forefront of conversations like consent, kink, sexual autonomy, and representation. However, due to it being regulated to chick content, there's a lack of trust in the genre, and if anything, it's disappointing that a series like Bridgerton, that has so many of those 2000 problems, ended up being the series to prove everything wrong. Quinn said this to Shondaland: "It is no surprise that Rhimes and company would look past prejudices the romance genre has and say, hey, this is a great story, because they're all about storytelling. But I think people really haven't looked to romance novels as a viable adaptation, in part because there is some stigma around them. They're by women, for women, primarily edited by women. More specifically, I think the historical novel has been passed over because of the expense. Historical romance is going to be expensive to do, unlike most contemporary stories. If you wanted to do a big period piece, you could go with a classic with prestige attached to it. Yet that prestige ends up being a lot of white novels, and people don't want more of that. Although that does make the Bridgerton question come back up. Time to talk about that scene. I would first like to say trigger warning for sexual assault and rape. This is the time code if you want to skip this section or skip the specific sections I'm talking about it. And do not worry, you do not need to hear this part to decide. And if the show has triggered you, I apologize. But I wanted to talk about this in a fair amount of depth to give all the context. One of the biggest problems with the scene in the show is that it does not consider what Daphne did as sexual assault. So let's backtrack. In the show, Simon's father was an abusive figure who was so obsessive about having a male heir that he forced his wife to keep getting pregnant even though it was hard for her body. She dies in childbirth and Simon is born, but he has a hard time speaking and has a stutter growing up that all but causes his father to disown him.
It is a deep enough wound to live with the knowledge that you shall one day inherit Hastings, but to witness your struggle is too great an insult. You are as useless as your mother proved to be.
Simon in the show grows out the stutter and vows on his father's deathbed not to have any heirs.
The only vow I will ever make in my life. I will never marry. I will never sire an heir. The Hastings line will die with me.
Therefore, part of his initial reluctance to marry Daphne is knowing she wants a family. He tells her that he can't have children, and Daphne, not being sexually educated, assumes that he is physically unable to have children, decides that this is okay, and eventually goes through with the marriage. Eventually, Daphne figures out after seeing Simon pull out that there's something not right about this. She asks her lady maid about sex and realizes that Simon has lied to her. They have sex, and during the encounter, Daphne gets on top of Simon to prevent him from being able to pull out, and he ejaculates inside of her as an attempt to get pregnant. They have a very dramatic confrontation where the entire scene is framing it as Simon's betrayal over Daphne, but ignoring that Daphne has just violated Simon's autonomy and done something that he would not do. She has removed his ability to give sexual autonomy and consent to be a father.
How could I? How could I? You lied to me.
I did not lie.
I trusted you. I trusted you more than anyone in this world, and you took advantage. You seized an opportunity, and so I did the very same.
I told you I cannot give you children.
Cannot and will not are two entirely different things.
Now, this scene and its aftermath are different in the books in a few significant ways that I think are worth addressing. And I want to say this up front. I do not think that either one is right. Do I think the book handles it better? Yes. But I think that it's important to realize that it gives a certain amount of nuance that the book, that the show did not have. It's still wrong, but more nuanced. but you can see what you think of it as we continue. So 1. Daphne figures out on her own that Simon can't have children, and they have a confrontation about it that is separate from the non-consent scene. Daphne decides to sleep in her own rooms, and Simon tries to manipulate and uses authority against her.
You told me you couldn't have children, she interrupted, her eyes flashing with anger. There's a very big difference. Not, Simon said coldly, to me. I can't have children. My soul won't allow it. I see. Something shriveled inside Daphne at that moment, and she was very much afraid it was her heart. She didn't know how she was meant to argue with such a statement. Simon's hatred of his father was clearly far stronger than any love he might learn to feel for her. Very well, she said in a clipped voice. This is obviously not a subject upon which you are open to discussion. He gave her one curt nod. She gave him one in return. Good day, then. And she left. Simon kept to himself for most of the day. He didn't particularly want to see Daphne. That did nothing but make him feel guilty. Not, he assured himself, that he had anything to feel guilty about. He had told her before their marriage that he could not have children. He had given her every opportunity to back out, and she had chosen to marry him anyway. He had not forced her into anything. It was not his fault if she had misinterpreted his words and thought that he was physically unable to sire brats. Don't you ever lock a door against me again, he spat out. She shrugged. She actually shrugged. I desired privacy. Simon advanced several steps. I want your things moved back into our bedroom by morning, and you will be moving back tonight. No. What the hell do you mean, no? What the hell do you think I mean? She countered. Simon wasn't sure what shocked or angered him more, that she was defying him, or that she was cursing aloud. No, she continued in a louder voice, means no. You are my wife, he roared. You will sleep with me in my bed. No. Daphne, I am warning you. Her eyes narrowed to slits. You have chosen to withhold something from me. Well, I have chosen to withhold something from you. Me. He was speechless, utterly speechless. She, however, was not. She marched to the door and motioned rather rudely for him to go through it. Get out of my room. Simon started to shake with rage. I own this room, he growled. I own you. You own nothing but your father's title. Legally, I own you. Daphne just stared at him as she said, That's true. He closed the space between them in a heartbeat, his hands finding her shoulder. I can make you want, he whispered. I know, and even if I couldn't, you're mine. You belong to me. I could force you to let me stay. Daphne felt about 100 years old as she said, We would never do that.
In the scene itself, Simon is drunk, and Daphne realizes in the moment that she never realized that a man could be aroused and asleep. The scene plays out with Simon semi-awake and Daphne in full control of the situation.
She understood why he was so dead set against bringing a child into this world, but she hadn't forgiven him, and she certainly didn't agree with him. If he woke up with her still in his arms, he might think she was willing to settle for this version of a family. Slowly, reluctantly, she tried to pull away, but his arms tightened around her, and his sleepy voice mumbled, No. Simon, He pulled her closer, and Daphne realized that he was thoroughly aroused. Simon? She whispered, her eyes flying open. Are you even awake? His response was another sleepy mumble, and he made no attempts at seduction, just snuggled her closer. Daphne blinked in surprise. She hadn't realized that a man could want a woman in his sleep. She pulled her head back so she could see his face, then reached out to touch the line of his jaw. He let out a little groan. The sound was hoarse and deep, and it made her reckless. With slow, tantalizing fingers, she undid the buttons of his shirt, pausing just once to trace the outline of his navel. He shifted restlessly, and Daphne felt the strangest, most intoxicating surge of power. He was in her control, she realized. He was asleep, and probably still more than a little bit drunk, and she could do whatever she wanted. She could have whatever she wanted. A quick glance at his face told her that he was still sleeping, and she quickly undid his trousers. Underneath he was hard and kneeling, and she wrapped her hand around him, feeling his blood leak beneath her fingers. And God help her, but she wanted him to. She felt so powerful looming over him. She was in control, and that was the most stunning aphrodisiac she could imagine. She felt a fluttering in her stomach, and a strange sort of quickening, and she knew that she needed him.
Simon rages and ends up leaving the home for some time. Now, this scene has always been controversial, and readers and fans have discussed what this exactly means. Julia Quinn herself responded to an email about why she decided to include this scene.
She says, "Hi, Chris. Believe it or not, when the book first came out, not a single person blinked an eye at the scene. Yes, it was shocking, but no one seemed to feel that Daphne had done anything morally wrong. It was only as years passed and we gained new understanding of consent that people started to question her actions. But I don't think it was just our better understanding of consent that shaped readers' opinions. I think it's also because as women gain more agency over their lives, it becomes harder to identify with the powerlessness endured by women in the early 19th century. This is why I feel so strongly that you cannot analyze the scene by saying, if the genders were reversed, we would not tolerate this." So she's saying because I guess women were so oppressed at that time, we can't just say, let's reverse it. Because if we reverse it, yes, we're all going to feel like that was a violation. But she's saying because of the time, maybe we shouldn't look at that way. So she goes, "In that marriage, Simon has all the power. He effectively owns Daphne. He may choose to send her to another part of the country. He may choose to send her to another country, period. He may choose to never have, with her again every single night, or he can have with her every single night, whether she wants it or not. Legally, he has that right, and physically, he has ample power to enforce his wishes. Daphne is a duchess. She has great power within her society, but within her marriage, she has very little power. And the same society that grants her such social agency still defines her effectively as chattel of her husband. Simon also, as granted by societal norms, has knowledge that Daphne has been denied. And we know this because he's a rake, right? So he knows how it works. She didn't know that. And he takes advantage, and he uses this knowledge to take advantage of her. Would she have been such an eager participant in their relations if she had understood how procreation worked? I don't know. I tend to think not."
As for why the showrunner decided to include this scene, he said the following to Esquire. "We are a show that allows our female characters to be complicated and to be far from perfect. In the writer's room, we discussed that scene at length. We felt that the female characters on this show, Daphne especially, should be allowed to do just that. She should be flawed. She should be able to make questionable choices. What the showrunner doesn't understand is that by removing Book Simon's legitimate anger and making this scene a girl boss moment, he is erasing the complications of a white woman assaulting and using a black man for sex and breeding. It is dehumanizing, especially since Simon cannot rage out the same way in which a white man could. He is left just to be made the villain, when if the whole point is that Daphne made a fucked up choice, why not have her choice be framed as fucked up? In the book, both characters have to deal with the fact that they have manipulated each other. And there is a point that Quinn makes about how Simon enjoyed manipulating Daphne, and that definitely comes across more in the book than the show. I don't think it's appropriate to say that expressing women's vulnerability and lack of power needs to be expressed through sexual assault. I think we can have an argument about how sexual assault has always been a part of these stories and it gets blurred, but I think you have to acknowledge that in the forefront. Thankfully, Quinn herself is very open to the dialogue with people, and like I said, I can understand her concept on paper, but I think that it is a very, and I hate to use the term slippery slope because I know it doesn't usually mean this in context, but I think it's sort of, it doesn't make anything correct. And I do understand making Daphne complicated. That's fine. Her and Simon are both shitheads, but the show doesn't really do that, and I feel that's a disappointment. Okay, so part of what I've been seeing is a lot of discussion about Queen Charlotte. So alright, let's dispel this rumor right now. There is no legitimate, documented evidence that Queen Charlotte had any African heritage. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Schweritz, sorry, I slaughtered that, was a German princess who was raised in a similar style to the gentry until her brother ascended to the throne. She was a huge patron of the arts, had 15 children, 13 of them lived, and she created the annual Queen Charlotte's Ball, which was an annual British debutante ball, which is reenacted in Bridgerton. She has actually a really interesting history. The story between her and George III is actually really interesting. I would love to do some discussion of that because, you know, I love to talk about the stupid British monarchy. This rumor of her blackness started in some way in the 1940s with mixed-race Jamaican-American writer J.A. Rogers in a book called Sex and Race Volume 1, where he claimed she must have black ancestry because of her broad nose and lips. The Alan Ramsey portrait has often been referenced as a source for this. Okay. I'm so bad at doing that. Never mind. Redacted. I personally do not gatekeep blackness, okay? Hallie Suttonfield can come to my cookout, but this is literally based on nothing but a portrait. I know I thought Alex Kingston was mixed because of her hair, but sometimes whiteness just be hits like that, you know? Sometimes you just get a little bit of what, and you just, you know, you got a little bit of, but that don't make you black. Rogers compares Queen Charlotte to Alexander Pushkin, Alexander Dumas, Pierre, but we all know exactly where their African ancestry comes from. That is sadly not the case of Queen Charlotte. Alan Ramsey also claimed that her distant ancestor, Margarida de Castro de Souza, a 15th century Portuguese noblewoman who traced her ancestry to King Alfonso III of Portugal and one of his mistresses, Madriana, was from a black branch of the Portuguese royal family. But there is no evidence for this either. It's none. I don't say this to dismiss all of J.A. Rogers' work. He's still a very important historian of the black diaspora. I would totally check out his work, especially because it's Black History Month. But his take on Queen Charlotte is reach in every sense of the word. Okay, second editor note, because I just had to say this. I really despise the fact that he put up this quote saying that some historians or many historians think that Queen Charlotte was a mixed race, because that's just not true. Like, you can see a quick Wikipedia search that is not true. That is a rumor. It is not based on any sort of fact about her ancestry. And why I find this argument frustrating is that there have been black people among the aristocracy, among the elite, not many, but there have been some, and it didn't make life for black people exponentially better. Like, you know, with Queen Victoria's goddaughter, like, she was prominent, she ended up living a very well-off life, loved by Queen Victoria. Dido Bell, who was a real person that the movie Belle was inspired by, like, yes, I believe it was her uncle or grandfather, I forget which one, was a judge and like made a very important ruling on a case. So that's like one example of that. But that wasn't the aristocracy. Like, she was still a bastard. She was still sort of like a lesser nobility. So it's like, if we're going to talk about black people in history, especially attached to the monarchy, how about focus on the lives of those people? You don't have to make it up. Like, having black people be adjacent to monarchy has not made our lives easier. Like, having a black president didn't make the lives of black Americans better. Like, you know, it's like, none of that really plays out. And I just think that, like, just say you wanted to do it. Just say you wanted to do it, and you heard about the rumors and were like, you know what, it may not be true, but we thought, let's just flex with it. You don't have to, like, justify it through historical accuracy. This is a fictional show. But just because she's not black doesn't mean anything in the context of, you know, blackness in the aristocracy space. The Dumases, Sarah Vobes Bonetta, Abram Petrovich Gambal, Chevalier de Saint-Georges were all part of black people who are part of European society. And there are also many more that have gone unnamed because, as if you read the book The Black Tudors, you know that when Catherine de Aragon came in here, she came to the British Isles with black people. And there have been black people in Britain since the Roman Empire. Like, people of color have been interacting with Europe for a long time, and none of it's surprising. And we also do not need to validate black existence in period dramas through giving them attachment to whiteness. We have our own shit, and yeah, we don't all have to be kings and queens to be valuable, okay? Decolonize your minds to the monarchy. She says that she works on her piece on female monarchs, but that's for education. Bridgerton is an entertaining show, and while it doesn't ask much of its audience, sometimes to its detriment, I have been able to sit through it 2.5 times and not be bored. It is not anywhere near as radical in its racial politics as Brandy Cinderella or Harlots or Dickinson, and is non-existent when it comes to its queerness for all intents and purposes. Like, I do not count that one weird queer baiting scene, like, no. But it did allow a bunch of black talent to get their flowers, and while yes, I do wish more of them were darker skinned, it doesn't take away the success story that this tells the period drama industry. That we don't need all white people to be in these series. And I'd say that if you want a taste of the Regency era with a black woman with a deep melanated complexion, I would check out PBS's Sanditon, which is based on an unfinished novel by Jane Austen, but features a West Indian black woman as the rich alpha debutante played by American actress Crystal Clark. I would also say watch period dramas that aren't just taking place in the West. There are great K-dramas, watch some Nollywood stuff. You know, there are other period stories that you could get into and are fun. As an extra bonus for my Patreon members, I had a little chat with my friends Sarah and Paige from The Princess and the Scrivener, and we discussed our thoughts about Bridgerton, and it was a lot of fun, and it will be available for everyone to see on my Patreon at the $2 level and above. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention is also, like, y'all need to get some robot-y people in here, because you know the British people, they hate the robot-y, the travelers, so you gotta make sure, because you gotta remember that British racism, it be hitting everybody.